Greetings, everyone, and happy post-Thanksgiving week. And welcome to this training, December 5th, provided through the ESPC campaign. Today, we're covering paying for your project and helping understand the ESPC project financials, financing options, and then also the important leveraging opportunity and the effect of contributed funds. Advance, Chris. So my name is Deb Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Services Coalition, and I'll be kind of running things in the background and hand it over to our Principal Technical Lead and Trainer, Chris Halpin, here in just a moment. So housekeeping today, if you have questions, you can unmute yourself and raise your hand. That's an option. You can also use the chat. We'll keep an eye on that and try to get all those answered either through the presentation or certainly at the end. So you can, again, unmute if you need to and ask your question then. We'll also be recording this, and it'll be provided later through the ESPC campaign. And some of the polling questions at the end won't be recorded and distributed, so don't worry about it. You can answer honestly at the end, sort of an evaluation of how the training is going. Next slide. Yeah, again, I'm Deb Taylor, Executive Director of the Energy Services Coalition, and Chris Halpin is with us today again, our principal trainer, who has lots of experience as an owner's rep and other different roles in ESPC projects over the years. Move forward. Chris,
right,
let me turn this over to you and let you kind of summarize your bio here.
All right. Thanks, Deb. Hey, good morning and or afternoon, depending on where you're located. I appreciate you all spending the time with us today. I know it's a big commitment for everybody, and we really, truly appreciate it. So I'm not going to go through a list. I've been doing this for decades in energy efficiency, pretty much my whole career, and acted as an ESPC owner's rep for almost 20 years. I had my own company doing this for quite a long time, and still do project facilitation for the feds and a little bit here and there in the mush market, but primarily focus on doing this for Energy Services Coalition and Department of Energy, trying to help all of you learn more about this exciting topic of energy savings performance contracting. Back to you, Doug.
Yeah, and so a little bit about the Energy Services Coalition, if you're not familiar with this. We're a national nonprofit organization, public-private partnership between state public officials and private sector implementers of energy savings performance contracting. The idea here is to raise the level of education for all parties so that there are better projects and better outcomes for everyone. So I'm going to launch a quick poll, and I'll say if you've attended before, you probably have seen these questions, and there's not the need to answer them necessarily. But if you haven't, please respond to the poll. We're trying to get a sense of who's on and what level of experience and background you have with ESPC projects, and how we can use this information to better tailor these trainings going forward. So we'll leave this open for just a second, recognizing that it's blocking the screen, and then I'll share the results also, so you'll know who else is on and what their level of experience is.
All right, great. Thanks, Deb. Okay, while you're filling that out, this is a list of acronyms, most of which are used in this presentation. It's a good sort of a helpful reference. And you'll notice through this that most of these are pretty busy slides, and I'm not going to read everything to you. But when I do this, and I'm a webinar attendee, I always like to have a lot of the information there for me so I can go back and look at it later, or if I'm going to forward it to colleagues and so on, and or employees below me, like I used to do. There's a lot of content there, right? So, and just in general, this is a lot of information, right? Performance contracting is, a relatively complex vehicle, and there's a lot of moving parts, but it's a wonderful thing for those of you who are in state and local governments and school districts, higher ed, and so on. It's an amazing tool. And I would usually spend hours talking about this sort of thing with my clients when I was doing this full time, but we're going to try to cover it in roughly an hour. So I'm more than happy to answer questions again, and we'll talk about this some more towards the end. If you don't mind, we'll just hold questions to the end unless there's something, really, really pressing you want to ask about. So anyway, the objective here is really get an overview of the project financials with a performance contract, what financing options you have, and the amazing leveraging effect on contributed funds, whether it's capital appropriations you have in your own budget or grants and things you can get from other government agencies or utility rebates and incentives and so on. We've already done the introductions. We're going to go through sort of what is performance contracting very quickly, go through sort of at a high level of project financials, the process for actually securing this funding and financing, and then different sources where you can find this money and do what we call capital stacking. Then pro forma cash flows, which are the actual, cash flow document that gets used in virtually every business out there to see where the money's coming from and how it's going to be paid back over time. And then we'll finish up with Q&A and some great links to different resources you can go to. So what is performance contracting? If you've watched some of these trainings before, this is, a repeat slide, but it's basically, at least the way I look at it, it's a financial mechanism used to pay for today's facility upgrades with tomorrow's energy savings, right? Without you having to go into your usually pretty precious capital funding, right? Where you have all kinds of things you need to spend money on as a public employer and NGO, and often you don't have enough to do what you need to do for your facilities. But the way I look at this, and this is an old tagline from EPA Energy Star that I've borrowed here, done properly, performance contracting has the performance of a hedge fund with the risk of a T-bill, right? So you get really good returns, reasonable returns, 8 to 12% typically returns, sometimes more, sometimes 20, 25% return, but with very little risk as long as it's done properly, right? And at the end of the day, it's really sophisticated design build contracting that has a guarantee to it that not many design build contracts have, right? So the owner and the ESCO have got sort of, skin in the game, to use the golf term, for the term of the contract. So what's in these deals? Financials, right? So at a high level, the ESCO designs and installs all these ECMs, or energy conservation measures, or upgrades, they're called, or FIMs, there's a bunch of different names for them. And you basically pay for that project through reduced utility and other operating expenses. So your electric bill, gas bill, water bill, sewer bill are all going to go down, propane and so on. And in a lot of cases, outside contracts you have with service providers having to constantly replace light bulbs and motors and things like that, all of that will be reduced, right? And those savings are then sort of fenced and used to repay the loan over time. We'll talk about that some more. In general, I mean, one of the reasons performance contracting is so popular, there's no upfront investments required, right? If this wasn't an issue, you would need performance contracting, right? You just go through your normal design bid build and get everything done, but then you'd have to, wait 3 to 5 years to get the money, which is usually the problem. It also allows you to leverage capital funds with private financing, right? And for me, I've been in this both on the ESCO side back in the 90s and here on the owner's rep side for the past just about 25 years. Leveraging sometimes a little bit of money, a couple of $100,000, $1 million, can really provide you with a lot of scope if you leverage it with private financing. And we'll talk about that in a lot more detail through this training. And this guaranteed savings, right? This is the key to all of this. And this is why measurement verification, which we covered a couple of trainings ago, is so important to these deals, right? That is sort of the keystone to you being able to make these payments, is that you have to be comfortable that these savings are going to actually occur. And having a good, strong contract, as we talked about in the training a month or so ago, having a good, strong contract will allow you to do this in a way that you'll feel comfortable telling your finance folks, okay, you're going to take money out of this budget and put it into the payback the finance budget, right? And many states require that there's a net positive cash flow in these deals every year of the contract, which is a great rule because you don't want to have savings that are going up and down. That's very, very hard to finance. And these terms typically range from 15 to 25 years. 15 to 18 seems to be the sweet spot from the finance folks' perspective. And for a lot of public entity, leadership folks, they don't want to really obligate their constituents for anything more than a 15 to 20-year term anyway, except for bonds. You see a lot of, school districts and so on will do 30-year bonds all the time. So I like to tell people that, hey, if you're going to look at financing for this, it's usually a shorter term than what you do typically for long-term bonding. And, one of the reasons many financiers are interested in this is because the risk of non-payment is very small, right? Because they know that the ESCOs are guaranteeing the savings. And almost nothing else that happens with public procurement is that way, right? If you raise money for a new chemistry building, hoping that you're going to get, say you're in higher ed, you're going to get more chemistry students, you're hoping, right, you're going to get more chemistry students to pay the enrollment fees to be able to pay that building back over the next 30 years. It's not that way with performance contracting. From a snapshot point of view, right, and everyone has seen this slide, it's been in, hundreds of presentations over the years. Basically, we're talking about your existing O&M budget, energy and O&M budget. You're going to reduce this amount you spend every year, and you hand off to your utilities every year, and reallocate that money to paying back financing with a small increment of net savings at the top, right? That's that small bar at the top. And after that, 15 to 20, 25 years, once that's all paid off, you have then the savings that go right back to you for the rest of the life of the contract. So from a long-term perspective, and this is one of my favorite slides I've seen, anything to do with performance contracting, it shows you how your utility costs, right, on the vertical axis versus time on the horizontal axis. You're going along at, business as usual for the first few years. You do a performance contract, and you can see how those bars in the last slide are being projected over time with a slightly increased cost due to escalation, right? You take a chunk out of that energy usage and you use it to pay back the loan. And at the end, you're left with these, few bars of full savings over the rest of the term of the loan. So it's budget neutral, right? So the money you're saving in one place, you then respend in another place, which is super helpful because I know with a lot of my clients in the past, they've got money to say replace their chiller plant, right? Whatever. Saves a bunch of money. And then they get,
I don't know. Thought it was
Hey,
on.
can everyone please mute themselves? Thank you. They get rewarded by the budget department the next year by losing part of their budget, right? They're like, great job, you saved $200,000 for taking that out of your budget when you really need that money, right, to do other things. So this is a way to fence that money to allow you to move forward in a budget neutral way, right? So again, that's one of the things I think is absolute magic with performance contracting. So where does this happen in the performance contracting process? And again, if you've been through some of these trainings before, this is one of the early slides we show that DOE considers performance contracting in 5 different phases, right? Planning, procurement, the IGA, developing the contract, getting into the design, construction, commissioning, and project acceptance, and then the performance period, right? With financing, planning for the financing is one of the first things you do, right? And we'll talk about that in some more detail in a few minutes here, but you want to figure out, is there a deal? About how much is it going to cost and how am I going to get the money, right? That's one of the first few things you do. You want to make sure there's some there before you go through a whole big complex procurement or multiple procurements. So the first thing you really want to do is consult your financial advisor. And most sizable organizations have got an outside FA or financial advisor that they consult above and beyond their internal folks, their CFO or vice chancellor for finance and administration, whatever the title of the person is. And they get you through the first couple of phases of this. Then you put out your RFP to hire the financier. Around the same time, you get your IG agreement executed. And then once you know about how much this whole project is going to cost you and what the savings are going to be, when the ESCO gets to about 60, 70% completion, that's when you sign the deal with your financier, right? So then you lock in the money. So then when you give the ESCO the notice to proceed, you have the money sitting there in an account ready to use. And it gets paid out over the whole design and construction period. Then the repayments start in phase 5. Right, so that's sort of how it works from a process point of view, or excuse me, timeline point of view. So the process itself, is there an opportunity here, right? And usually there's plenty of opportunities, no shortage of deferred maintenance, right, that any of you have got to deal with, right? The first thing you want to do is identify, sort of a high level idea of what the scope is. Like we know we still have all fluorescent lamps, say, right? And you want to get rid of those and put in LEDs. They last a lot longer, they use half the energy, so on and so forth. Um, One of the best ways I've seen to do that is to hire an owner's rep, which you've heard me refer to multiple times in other trainings, have them do what we call a high level pre-qualification assessment that results in sort of a high level ECM or energy conservation measures summary table, which we'll show you one here shortly, to sort of give you a high level idea of, well, yeah, we know lighting, we know controls, we definitely want to do retrocommissioning. There's chillers, boilers, windows, all these different things about how much is there for us to do. And is it something that's really going to be financeable? Is it going to self-finance? And that's one of the first steps you can make without going through a whole long procurement to get an ESCO, and then they do a preliminary assessment, and that's 6, 8 months later, right? So this is something you can do sort of right out of the gate. Um, Evaluate any capital appropriations that you have or your state energy office has. That's again your first call is, hey, let's talk to our financial people. Your second call is the state energy office, and talk to them about what technical assistance they can provide and any money they can provide. And right now, right, and we'll talk about this some more later, there's a lot of federal money that's already been awarded, but there's still some available. And we're not sure what's going to happen with the new administration coming in, but you want to pay attention to that. And next, you want to do a real due diligence process. Again, everybody, please make sure you're muted. Work with your financial advisor to do this initial due diligence. And that way you'll be able to see, do we have any constraints? Is there a debt capacity issue, right? And that's been a big problem since the pandemic, where a lot of building went on beforehand, and then organizations lost the revenue, and they had a very hard time dealing with payments that were due on large bond projects, right? So there's a lot of issues around that you'd want to talk to your financial advisor about. The next step, issue your ESCO RFP, negotiate the investment grade audit agreement, and set out the financial expectations. Again, this is working with your in-house folks, your outside FA, your owner's rep, everybody that you have in your team, your legal folks. What's the maximum contract term you want to go, right? So before you put an RFP out there, you want to give the ESCO community an idea of how long are we willing to pay a project off for. Ask them for indicative pricing. You heard me talk about that in this IGA review training previously. What are their maximum fees going to be, markups, and so on and so forth. So they're not going to give you pricing for a project in the RFP response. They're going to give you indicative pricing. If it's a $10 million project, ultimately, how much is their fees and markups going to be on that, right? Try to give them an idea of what your maximum capital contributions are. And so if you can tell them, listen, it's going to be, we have $1 million and we want to do a lot of stuff. Obviously, that's not enough. That's why we're doing a performance contract. It gives them an idea of sort of what the overall scope might look like. And then lastly, these escalation rates for labor and energy costs. Right? We'll talk about that some more later on. You want to select your financier, like I talked about in that timeline slide. Right around the time you're getting an idea from the ESCO about how much this is going to cost and getting your 60% IGA, they've gotten a pretty decent idea, sort of rules of thumb, talking to contractors that may not have walked contractors through your facilities yet, but they're certainly getting a better idea of how much this is going to cost. And when you get your financing put together, you want to say what the maximum is that you think you're going to spend with contingency and everything else on top, so that when you put out the RFP, you have an idea of what terms and conditions are going to be for the most you're going to expect to spend. You can always borrow less, right? But it's hard to then start working with a financier and say, oh, we want 10 or 15 or 20% more. That becomes difficult. And you may end up getting protests and so on and so forth. So ultimately, this is all going to be worked into this pro forma cash flow, right? Like all the ESCO's costs, all your costs, all the escalation fees and all that. We're going to talk about that. Once you get down to the 90% IGA and approve it, you know that here is the deal we're actually going to implement. That's when you want to sign the contract with the financier. They deposit the money into an account that they have access to and that you give approvals on, so that when you start getting the payment requests from the financier, you can then go through the escrow, like they give you monthly draws, like you would expect in any construction project. Your escrow is going to do the same thing. They're going to ask for their first mobilization payment, which is probably 20, 30, 40% of the total project cost. That covers everything they've spent in the investment grade audit, a preliminary assessment if you had one, and all of sort of their setup costs, mobilizing on the site and buying materials and so on and so forth. And then the payment process starts, right? So that's in a nutshell. Usually that would take me an hour or two to explain to people. So this is at a very high level. So what are the sources for all this money, and how do they get stacked? So some of the most common ones, when you're putting your stack of capital together, is third-party financing. And this is typically arranged through an outside company, private company, often with assistance from a financial advisor, right? And I keep saying that over and over. I have found that deals that I've worked on in the past, where they had an outside FA, really helped. Much like them hiring me when I used to do this as an owner's rep full time, an outside legal expertise, having those three folks together on your team usually made these projects much more successful. There's a lot fewer hiccups if you had, outside professionals helping you. DOE, through their Better Building Solutions Center, which if you haven't used before, I highly recommend you go and spend a fair amount of time looking through that website, because it's got a huge amount of helpful material, and template forms and this and that. And there's some links at the end of this that'll talk about that in some more detail. The most common type of financing, and I think it's like 90, 95% of performance contracts over the years, have used these tax-exempt lease purchase agreements, or TELP is what they're usually known as. Some of the benefits of these, it's tax-exempt interest payments, right? So this is huge, because you're typically a public government agency. You don't have to pay tax. You don't have to pay taxes on these either. They're a lot easier to get through the approval process than a bond, right? Just because of the way they're designed. And again, I'm not a finance person. I'm just an engineer. So again, you'd want to get into the details of this with your finance folks. And one of the biggest sort of gifts to this industry is the finance folks allowing non-appropriation language in these contracts. So that means if you sign this deal with the financier, and 2 years later, like we had during the pandemic, right? A lot of agencies were just not getting any revenue in, right? And the taxes weren't coming in, enrollment in colleges just wasn't happening like it had. And not many of them did this, but if the money does not get appropriated to pay that off, there's no problem, right? For the owner. The financier basically just has to eat that as a loss until the following year. So, and again, I'm not a finance person, but that's something you would definitely want to talk to your finance folks about. Some other examples include bonds, which everybody here is familiar with. That's how most public construction gets done in the US. They're low cost, certainly these days. Those and private placement TELPs are pretty close. They allow for up to 30-year terms, but they're a lot less flexible. And I've lived through these where you have to go through public referendum. I used to do this for a lot of states up in the Northeast and the Southeast. And if the referendum fails, or you've just spent a year planning a project and you're kind of out of luck, right? This has happened to several school districts I used to work for, and cities and towns, and it was a shame, right? So TELP, I think, really helped a lot in that case. Loans are out there. There's a lot out there right now through the bipartisan infrastructure law. Certain states like Delaware, through Energize Delaware, has a great program where they'll loan money to entities. There's other states like Texas, Lone Star program. I've got a lot of opportunities to do this above and beyond, standard outside third-party loans. There's certificates of participation. I used to do a lot of this for the state of Rhode Island, and they were experts at using COPs to finance these. And again, I don't know a lot about the details, but they're a really good way to finance projects like this. Then funding options, right? Everyone's familiar with grants. Almost all of you probably have either a full-time or part-time grant writer that helps you respond to grant requests that come out. And there's a lot of it out there now. Like I said, I've been at this, next year, it'll be 40 years. I've never seen this amount of money out there. in the marketplace for energy projects, right? Nowhere close. Arrow is the closest that I've seen 10, 12 years ago. And what's going on now with bipartisan infrastructure law is probably 10x, and the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, is another probably 10x on top of that. So you want to be able to become familiar with this, or once you get your ESCO on board, that's be one of the first things they do is scour the country for what grants and funds are available. You know, folks like FEMA have grants for increasing your resilience, these brick grants that can provide you with, you know, up to $1 million, I think the number is these days, to be able to put towards a resilient project, so solar and battery storage, for example. So capital funds, right? This is one of the more common ones where you have money. Say you have $300,000 or $400,000 to replace your chiller plant, and it really needs $1 million, right? Most chiller plants need a lot more money than what you get funding for to do it right. This is where you can take that money, apply it towards your performance contract, and use that leveraging capability that I mentioned, and we're going to talk about in some more detail. So one of the cautionary notes around this is if it's in your budget for this year or the next year, it's perfectly fine, right? Because that's money you know you're going to spend, right? You've put that out there. What I've seen happen in the past is, you know, sometimes the owners will get either talked into by the ESCO or just sort of like, you know, we think we can take the risk here, take future capital funds that are not budgeted yet and commit them towards the repayment stream. That's something you want to be very, very careful about, right? Because you could put yourself in a pretty, you know, tough position if it's a large number. Small numbers, not so much, but if you put it at, you know, 10% of that budget is capital funds that haven't been budgeted, that could land you in some hot water. So that's just something to keep in mind. The utility rebates and incentives have been around for years. There's a lot more of them around now in certain cases, depending on where you're located. But virtually every state has got them. Here's a great resource, the database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency. It's run by North Carolina State University. You click on this link and it tells you by state which utility has which different programs. And again, most of you have probably run into these, but there's a lot of money available now to do this. And depending on where you're located, the more comprehensive a project you do, you can get bonus payments for the utility. So instead of just doing lighting or just doing controls, you do lighting, controls, and HVAC together, and you get like an extra 10 or 20% bump on top of the standard prescriptive rebates. And then, of course, tax incentives, where you've never been eligible for them before, but now you are, right? The ESCOs can take the 179D, even sometimes an owner's rep can take 179D. And this elective pay part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And these are all live links, right? You'll be able to look at these when you get the final version of this. This is an amazingly powerful tool, right? So you can get, and again, I talked about this at length in one of the previous trainings and also one of the first trainings that was done in March, which we have a link to later on in this presentation, talks about this ad nauseum, right? But you can get a minimum of 30% paid for by putting in basically electrification projects, heat pump water heaters, solar, battery storage, EV charging infrastructure, right? Stuff like that. That's just 30% gets paid to you directly by the IRS. And depending if you're in like a certain census tract that's underserved areas, it's an extra 10%. Tribes get an extra 10%, right? Justice 40 areas get an extra 10%. So there's a lot of opportunity there to get extra funding. So some of the current sources these days, their Department of Energy itself has a lot of money through the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA. One of the ways they're putting it out there through K through 12 schools is the Renew America Schools grants. A lot of this has already been awarded. That's been out for a couple of years now, especially for the BIL part of it. There is a new round coming up, but they just awarded like millions and millions of dollars, right, in the past 2 years. And this graphic over here shows you where in the country a lot of these awards have been made. And for state and local governments, and just as an example for Delaware, every state has received an award on a formula basis. And just like they get funding for the state energy offices on a formula basis on an annually, these extra awards have been given out as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And for example, Delaware, which does a great job with performance contracting, got $1.6 million through this, and their sub-grant is going to all the local cities, towns, and governments. And they're going to install solar panels and battery storage and emergency shelters across Delaware's 3 counties. Right. So what a great use of this money. And if you can put a performance contract around that, that does the lighting, the controls, windows, EV, whatever else, you're getting your resilience paid for by this grant, or part of the resilience aspect paid for by this grant, while financing the whole rest of the deal, right? Um, and like in this case, the city of Wilmington put together a GHG reduction plan that outlined pathways for the city to reduce their GHG emissions, right? And that can all be usually included inside a performance contract, where the ESCO can help you put these plans together as part of your project, right? Which takes a lot of the burden off of you because you already have enough to do. Because I know that most of you already have 4 or 5 jobs. Right? I know that one. So this is the leveraging we've been talking about, or I mentioned before. It can have a huge leveraging effect, right? A small bit of contributed funds, because you're taking the principal down that you have to borrow, right? The compounding effect of that over time is massive. Just like when you put a down payment for a mortgage on a house, or 20% down on a car loan, you know in your personal life the difference and repayment that makes. You get a $600 a month car payment down to $500 a month just by putting some cash down, right? It's no different here. Um, it allows you to increase your project scope, right? Just like I talked about with that chiller plant, you can now do, not just the chillers, but all the pumps and the cooling towers and the fans, and all the other stuff that goes along with chiller plants that usually gets left out. It gets value engineered out of design but build projects. Here you can build it all in. You also get to accelerate the savings, because putting that money in now allows you to afford the things in a shorter time frame, right? You're not going to have to wait a couple of years to save up the money to then do the comprehensive project. And reduce financing costs, right? Your funds, and we show just a couple of examples here. This isn't from like a real project or anything, but you putting in $200,000 in capital allows you to only have to do a $4 million TELP, right? Versus a $4.2 million TELP. And that alone just reduces those payments over time. Now, one of the cautions about this is most utility incentives and rebates, and it's always been this way since the 30-something years I've been doing this. Utility's been paying you after you install the measures, right? Which makes sense, right? They'll write you a letter of intent ahead of time. You go ahead and put everything in. They'll sometimes send an inspector out, make sure, okay, everything's good. You show us the receipts and so on, and then send you the check. Sometimes they do the big check ceremony for you. So you have to plan ahead of time to be able to bridge that funding. You're going to float that, like certain large banks. I know 3 or 4 of the larger banks out there who fund a lot of these projects have special tools out there just for that. They'll allow you to do like a one-time upfront payment, or year 1, year 2 payment towards the project without any penalties, towards the refinancing without any penalties. And usually they put penalties in there because they use a lot of patient investors who just want that straight stream of money over 15 or 20 years. And they don't want you upsetting the apple cart by throwing money in a year or 2 later. So IRA is the same way, right? The IRS will not pay that money to you until the following tax year. So you may go a year and a half without being paid for that. So that's, again, and there's a whole nother presentation about that stuff. And this is the one I've been referencing, right? So this was a webinar done earlier in the spring by DOE with some of their campaign supporters. This one, and again, this is the link to go to this whole presentation, which I urge you to go back and take a look at. But what this shows, and I'll just, again, this is a 45-minute presentation that basically showed on the base case, you have a $1.3 million in savings, $16.4 million project, just as, straight ahead finance project. You add rebates in, you add the investment tax credit for solar, add the owner's funds altogether of $1.5 million. So you've added a fair amount. The total project cost that's allowable goes up from 16.4 to $20 million, 20 and a half. The project the project cost funded by savings and leverage funds goes up to 28 million. So you get another $11 million in additional scope, right? So you've leveraged $7.5 million by adding $1.5 million, right? So, and again, we're not going to go through this in detail. Aldo Mazzafero, who did this part of the presentation, did a much better job here and rolling it all up over time. So it shows you the power, though, of what contributed funds can do in a third-party financed contract. And it all comes down to this, to the pro forma cash flow, because this is what the financiers use to judge whether they're going to lend you the money or not, right? Your credit, right, comes first. And the ESCO's credit comes second, but the overall deal and how much they're going to be willing to finance comes down to the pro forma. And that all starts here with the ECM summary table, right? This is where the ESCO basically puts together, and this is from a real project, right? An actual project that got implemented at a small town up in the Northeast. Where the ESCO says, all right, it's cost us this, and we're not going to expect you to look at these numbers, right? It's quite the eye chart, but this is extremely comprehensive project. You can see the list of measures down the left-hand side. It's like 20 something measures, all the costs, all the savings, and the payback over time, right? And in this case, they were able to get some grants and funds and stuff to be able to lower the costs. But this is just, what's the payback? That doesn't really have a whole lot of bearing on financing. It's getting into the financing over the life of the term and what those costs look like as they're amortized over, a 15 to 20-year term. And what does that come from? It all comes from the savings. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, the sources of savings and how they're measured and verified are the absolute key to whether this is going to be successful or not. And some of you may have seen me explain this slide in one of the past trainings where, just as an example, when you replace these fluorescents with the LEDs I mentioned earlier, you put in the LEDs which use, half the power, the connected load of an LED lamp. So you use half the power, you put in occupancy sensors that reduces the operating time, right? So you're going from the yellow box to the blue box by increasing the efficiency, and you're getting your energy savings that way. You get operations and maintenance savings by running them less, so therefore you don't have to replace them as often. And ultimately, either you have somebody you're paying to do this, replacing lamps constantly, they can be doing other work now. Or if you have an outside contractor that you have come in and, once a year they come in and they just do wholesale lamp replacement, you now can reduce that contract, right? So having this in place is what leads to having a successful financing project, right? So some of the things around pro forma cash flows revolve around doing this on an open book basis. And again, if you've watched these trainings before, I'm constantly talking about that because that is what I feel is one of the best practices you can employ in a performance contract. So you really know where all the money's coming from and then how it's going to go out the door when you're making the repayments. So it first starts with a feasibility assessment. And again, this is the one I talked about early on, where you can have an OR do this. They'll put together sort of a high-level cash flow for you to give you an idea of where it looks like and what the deal is going to look like. You can use them in your overall financial planning. So again, this is when you're going to go to a school board or city council or mayor or whatever the case may be, you want to have something that's going to look reasonable and attainable and achievable for them to give you the go-ahead. It also gives you the opportunity to do a comparison of financing options, right? So if you have a cash flow that shows, well, if we put in $1 million versus $2.5 million, like that last example I showed, it can have a huge difference in that cash flow and really help you decide, you know what, maybe we should put some of that money elsewhere, put it into IT infrastructure, laptops for students, whatever the case may be. They're also used to basically value risk assessment, right? So you can say, boy, look at if we go with a higher allowance or allotment for rate increases, it increases the area under the curve that I showed you at the very beginning of the presentation. So more scope, but you have to be willing to take in the fact that you're agreeing to instead of say a 3% escalation in utility fees, it's 3.5%, right? Which may or may not occur, right? So it's again one of the knobs that gets turned when you're negotiating these deals at their escrow at the end before you sign the deal. It also helps with contract negotiations. You can see where is all the money coming from, what's going to be paid for through financing, what you're going to be paid for out of your own pocket and make those sort of value decisions at the time, having the cash flow in front of you. Um, One of the things that I have always found that's super helpful is during the investment grade audit development process, and you've probably heard me talk about this before, 30%, 60%, 90% submissions by the ESCO, each should come with a cash flow, right? And during that, and most of the ESCOs, if not all of them now, have online sort of real-time tools to show you if we change the scope and we add in the chiller project or a boiler replacement project, what does that do to the cash flow, right? When you put it all in without an extra funding, it sends it into the red, right? So you have put some cash until it goes into the black. Those kinds of things are such fantastic learning opportunities in real time for everybody that's part of the deal. It can take what would usually take weeks to discuss can happen in an hour or two. Right. And I saw this, I ran a project at Department of Energy headquarters like 15 years ago. It was amazing how powerful that tool was to help people really focus on what the ultimate goal was, which is to get to a self-financing successful project. So this is what one of these looks like, right? And this is again from that same real project. The yellow highlights are the inputs and assumptions that go into the performance contract financing. The green is the terms and timelines that everyone is expecting to use, and then the costs and savings over time, right? And again, this is a real eye chart. We're not going to use this. So we broke this down by one of the three categories, right? So we've got the initial one, the project value. So this is sort of the ESCO's sell price. They've come up with their subcontractor costs, all their markups, commissioning fees, training, education, finance, all the stuff that's going into their cost, not finance, excuse me, what's going into their costs. And then utility rebates, right? What money are you going to be getting back? And in this case, the owner's deducting the rebates from the financed amount, which means they're like, okay, well, we're going to be getting this money. So the ESCO must have been guaranteeing that in their deal, which doesn't often happen. Most ESCOs are like, we're not in control of this. If you go from one program year to the next, I guess happened recently in the past 5 years, a lot of utilities are basically getting rid of incentives for LED lighting because now it's just common practice, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And you've heard me refer to this before, probably, in this case, there was an owner's rep fee that gets financed, right? So you may have been paying your owner's rep out of pocket up until this point, but once the financing gets approved, you can take the money you've paid them to date, get that financed. That goes into a separate little fund from the ESCO's fee, right? The $14.9 million ESCO fee, the little tiny $500,000 for the OR. You can then repay whatever fund you used to pay that owner's rep for the first 6 months, 9 months of the project development, right? So there's no net out of pocket costs for you. Then you continue to take the rest of that money and pay the OR as you go through the rest of design, construction, commissioning, M&V, and then usually the first year or two of performance period. Then this loan value is the total amount to be borrowed, and in some cases you'll see, here under the project value, the legal fees, other fees that may be required. You hired an outside construction administration agent, something like that. That can all be included in this, right? And then what the TELP rate is going to be, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%, whatever that is going to be, that can have a significant effect on the cash flow, right? Just like, again, and everyone knows this from their personal life, getting loans for houses and cars and whatnot. A 1/4% to a 0.5% makes a huge difference in what your payment is going to be. Same thing with utility escalation. This is something that I put a link in here for NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, puts out a 10-year look ahead of what they expect utility rates are going to be over the next 10 years. Of course, it's never fully accurate, but it gets used, like the federal government uses this for every single federal performance contract, uses this as a source for what they expect costs to be over time. And again, that can have a huge effect on cash flow. Next is the terms and timelines, right? So in this case, they were using a 20-year savings term. So this is how many years they're going to allow the savings to accrue or record savings to be accrued. The loan repayment term is 20 years. That's typically how long the financing term is going to be. It usually matches the savings term, and in many cases, it must be greater than the useful life of the ECMs. This what's called the mechanical term here. That's a weighted average useful life of the ECMs. That's like, lighting is 10 years, chiller plant is 30 years, right? Controls is 15 years, and the dollar value of all of those doing a weighted average usually comes out from 15 to 17 years, and usually the financing is somewhere just beyond that, right? O&M savings term, again, usually matches the others. Talks about payments, the loan payments, the construction period, because you want to know how long is this going to take to get completed? Because in many cases, your finance agreement may require you to pay it starting in in month 19. And if there's a delay by the ESCO or by your own staff for whatever reason or weather, whatever the case may be, you have to start paying that loan back before you accept the project, right? So there's a lot of details along those lines that you want to be careful of. And in most cases, as finance payment starts, again, depending on how your contract reads, usually a couple of months after the construction ends. And that's what's being shown here, right? That allows you to do this post-installation report that, again, I talked about one of the previous trainings. So that ESCO provides you this report that says, okay, we did some initial measurement verification. It looks like your savings are on track. So you're not waiting the full year to see whether you hit the magic number or not, right? That gives you a much better idea, a lot of confidence that for you to accept the project, and then they start sending you the first invoices. And then construction savings can be included in a cash flow as a year zero payment. Because if it's going to take you 2 months to get a year to get a project complete, say the lighting and water and stuff is getting done in the first 3 to 6 months, you can accrue those savings and use those savings towards the project, towards the financing. So now in the actual operating period of this, the performance period, this is what it looks like, right? And again, this is a bit of an eye chart, but I just wanted to point out a few of the more important things. So your first few years of savings is guaranteed annual energy savings. They can fluctuate because usually things coming and going until it gets to sort of a steady state. Then it slowly increases. That's where you see that escalation rate that we've seen a few times already in the slides being applied to this number every year of the contract term. Then it gets aggregated towards the end up to, $17.5 million is a lot of savings for a town, right? And then the operations and maintenance savings slowly increasing over time. In this case, there were renewable energy credits and combined heat and power credits. So that, and again, not all states have this. States in the Northeast have this due to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's sort of like a mini carbon market that allows public entities to get this revenue. So in this case, this town was able to get these revenues, and it's pretty sizable by doing the solar and the CHP project. This is the capital cost avoidance I was talking about that you have to be careful of, right? It's something that's budgeted, that's great. And this is a nice small number, $30,000, $40,000 is not going to break the bank, but it helps with the overall financing principle. And then they total all the savings, and the combination, usually in a pro forma like this loan payment is slightly backloaded, right? It sort of matches what you saw in that early slide of the utility rates slowly go up over time. The payments slowly go up over time. And you're trying to, match that as you go from year to year. In this case, because they're getting so much annual revenue from these other streams, it's allowing them to reduce that payment over time, right? It's slightly front loaded. And you can see there's net positive cash flow every year of the contract term, right? And that's usually required by statutes so that you don't end up overpaying and then have, negative savings. You're then having to put more money into this deal year after year after year, right? So I think that's a super rule because it ends up making the development process very responsible towards you fiduciary requirements of your town charter or school district, whatever the case may be. All right, so that is all we have content-wise. I know that was an hour of drinking from a fire hose, and I'm sorry about that, but we have plenty of time for questions. Dub, you're putting up the first poll, and let's see if we've got.
Yeah. Chris will let you take a break and get your voice back. And while you're thinking of questions, and we'll enter the discussion phase of the training today, please take a little bit of time and complete this poll. We're always trying to make these more relevant, useful, and good, efficient use of your time. So your input is certainly appreciated here. And then we'll move into the Q&A part, and we have some common finance and funding questions to start with. And if you have additional questions, now's the time. Please raise your hand, unmute yourself, or enter into the chat, and then we can recognize you and take those questions.
All right. I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So I put some together here since we have some extra time to just give you some more detail. And you'll find a few of these are similar or the same to the last webinar that we did, where in many cases for, leadership and finance or administration and a lot of your agencies, they're always being told, right? The squeaky wheel is the head of facilities is like, listen, I need money. I need a lot of money. I've got, a couple of $1 million or sometimes tens of millions of dollars of deferred maintenance that we need to address, right? And can ESPC be used to help me with this? And, the answer is a resounding yes, right? This is one of the best uses of performance contracting I have found over the years, is really getting down deep into deferred maintenance, right? Instead of just, rewiring motors or, fixing the impellers on pumps and so on, being able to replace whole sets of equipment that may be 30, 40, 50, even older, and make a huge difference. And then the resilience of these systems that are absolutely, in many cases, critical to the operation of your facilities, right? And by putting them into a performance contract, not only are you getting them replaced in a thoughtful, planned out way instead of an emergency, right? Just what happens a lot, right? It's hottest day of the summer, the chiller breaks or your rooftop units go down or whatever, and you're calling, your emergency HVAC folks, and you're paying double or triple what you would have to pay, and you may not even get a piece of equipment that's sized properly because it's whatever they could get their hands on, right? As opposed to doing through a performance contract where you spend a year planning this out and buying equipment that right? Maybe you have a certain brand of air conditioning equipment, certain brand of controls that you're used to and all your folks know how to work on. You can then negotiate that into the deal for you, right? So it really can help in that way. Second question is, how much research should I do regarding funding and financing for the project before starting the whole process? And, I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning. And for me, having done this, for owners for many, many years, that's one of the first things we would do as an owner's rep. If the owner hadn't had time, and that's usually the problem, right? You all just don't have the time to do this. A lot of you have, certainly the background and the expertise to do it, but just you have too many other things to do. So that's where you get an outside person to really start researching for you, like going on this desire.org website or desireusa.org website, see what sort of utility incentives there are out there. Go to your state energy office website, or some of you already have existing relationships with the state energy office. And many of you actually on this have probably received money from the bipartisan infrastructure law through the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program, right? This is this formula program I was talking about towards the beginning of the presentation, where, hundreds of millions of dollars have already been handed out. And there's other things out there. Like I mentioned, there's FEMA, there's HUD, there's all these different entities out there who have a lot of money, at least right now, right? We're not sure what's going to happen. The new administration takes over, but a lot of this stuff was put in place so that it would be long-term money. A lot of it is 10-year money. So we're hoping it's going to stick around for a while. And how can I find out what a ballpark project cost and savings might be before going through the whole ESCO procurement process, right? And if you went through some of the earlier trainings, and I went through the ESCO RFP process, it's a thing, right? I mean, it's a fair amount of work. You're doing something where you're putting what would normally be 4 procurements into one, where you're hiring your energy auditor, your designer, your commissioning agent, and your builder basically all together at once. And there's a lot of responsibility there. So, that for me, one of the best ways to do that is, first get yourself an owner's rep right at the very beginning, right? A good experienced person or company who's been through this before with other clients that are similar to you. Have them do one of these pre-qualification assessments. And that really amounts to, say you have 10, 20, 30 buildings, you're not going to go visit them all, right? You have your owner's rep go visit a sampling, a representative sample of those buildings, take a look at your utility bill summaries, interview your operations and maintenance folks to find out really how are things being operated, where are the real pain points, and then come up with some high level ideas, right? And you're not looking for precision here, right? You're looking for high level ideas of what we think a project might look like that's potentially self-financing. And even if it's close, and this is like plus or minus 20, 25% cost-wise, that's the level of accuracy you're looking for. You're not looking for something that's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to put in place. This is not what we're looking for. Because with that tool in your hands, you'll be able to then go with some more confidence to your folks in positions of decision-making authority and funding authority internally and then externally, right? If you're going to go to the Board of Regents, if you're in higher ed, if you're going to go to city council, whatever the case may be, it gives you some more ammunition to feel more comfortable to answer questions about this. And you've had a professional put this together for you, right? You get like to the good housekeeping seal of approval from somebody to do something like that for you. And where can you find good resources for the incentives and rebates? And I've talked about this desireusa.org website. It's super helpful. There's others that are like that out there. And your state energy offices are an absolute wealth of information. And these days, a wealth of funding. There's still hundreds of millions of dollars that have not been spent yet in these programs. So make sure you do a deep dive into what's available out there. And this last question, if I only have half the funding I need to do a major upgrade, such as a chiller plant replacement, can ESPC help me leverage that money? And you can tell I'm a big fan of chiller plant replacements. I was involved in dozens and dozens of them over the years because that's the heart and soul of cooling buildings, especially in a warm environment. Because you just can't have children going to school or hospitals operating or all that without meeting certain temperature requirements. And I used this example earlier of having $300,000, $500,000 where you really need $900,000, $1 million to do a chiller plant replacement, right? Including building in controls that are forward-looking, right? Not just getting the base controls that are offered by that chiller manufacturer, say, which usually are proprietary. You putting in open protocol, comprehensive controls, and maybe even building analytics, doing an analytics layover over your whole system and all of your buildings that allow you to be really smart. And you've probably seen in some of our other trainings, my analogy I like to use of turning your buildings from a flip phone, like an old Motorola Razr, which were great, in 2005, to a new, iPhone 14 or the newest, Samsung phone that are really giving you insight into these buildings and allow you to avoid problems, right? And a performance contract can provide you both the technical means to do that. You hire an ESCO who is really good at doing this sort of stuff and packaging it in with all the rest of the measures, and the financing to put in place something that's fully comprehensive, not saving nickels and dimes here because this is all we have in our budget. Depending on what you can put together, what you can couple together in this cash flow documents I was showing you, you can do a really comprehensive project. And I've seen some of the best projects I've ever seen in my career were done through successful performance contracts, right? Something that folks can really be proud of, both, a true public-private partnership, right? Where you're providing a win for taxpayers, you're providing a win for the folks like you who are running these, and for those that you're reporting to, as well as for the ESCOs, right? And the other suppliers creating local jobs in your community and tax bases and all that, right? So hopefully that's given you a good background in all of this. Department of Energy has got a ton of resources around this, right? I mean, this is days and days you could spend researching these things, but these are all great links. This state energy office guide to braiding and stacking, really, how do you really put all of these different streams of money together? There's a great financing decision tree, which talks a lot about some of the things we went through here today. All the different financing options, which does a much more exhaustive treatment of this subject. Um, a list of DOE's financial allies. A lot of the banks and specialty lenders in this space are listed here. And this is an extensive toolkit to help you that DOE's put together. Federal Energy Management Program, which is the sister agency to the State and Community Energy Program, through this Performance Contracting National Resource Center, or PCNRC, put together this certificate series, primarily for owners reps, and I was lucky enough to help put that together for them. But it's really helpful for folks like you who are either want to do performance contracts or doing performance contracts. And it's a very comprehensive 8-module course that you get a certificate at the end of, and you get, PDH or CEUs, whatever you need. If you're, architect, engineer, whatever the case may be, this is super helpful, right? It goes into some of this stuff in a lot of detail. There's also a bunch of written guides and reports out there. Turning waste into wins, the business case for conducting M&V. That's a really good one. And expanding ESPC to new markets in hospitals, small project, K through 12, and water facilities. So I urge you to go back and take a look at these when you have time. And last but not least, this campaign that's making these trainings and webinars and workshops and all this and peer exchanges possible. Hopefully you're a member. If not, urge you to join. There's some things that you can get, benefits you can get that are not available to everybody, like this sort of a training. And this campaign is really trying to support the use of performance contracting, increase efficiency, modernize public buildings, reduce expenses, increase resilience, and meet lead by example goals, right? There's a lot of goals out there. And performance contracting, from my perspective, is the single best way to lower your costs, meet your, whether they're GHG goals, whether they're cost reduction goals, or whatever they may be. It's the best way to get it all done because you can do it in a comprehensive manner, planned, and on an open book basis, make sure you're getting a fair financial treatment, right? So DOE will provide a ton of help through this amplify and implement best practices approaches. This amplification toolkit is super helpful, right? So if you're interested, please complete the expression of interest at this link and get a partner agreement. And, please sign up. We'd love to have you. Some of the upcoming events, we've got December 9th in a couple of days, the EECBG Blueprint Cohort run by the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy. Have used NASCO here, and my friend Tim Unruh runs these, the head of NASCO. Please complete this form and get involved in that if you're part of the cohort. I know a lot of you on this call today are. Then the next thing we're doing, January 9th, this is this phase 5 I talked about earlier, the performance period, best practices for measuring impact and ensuring success. On the 13th is another blueprint cohort on contracting, learning about standard contract forms and forming the contract. I urge you to please sit in on that one because the contract is the single most important part of one of these deals. Then our friends at Lawrence Berkeley Lab are going to be hosting one called Getting Started, the eProject Express. For those of you who haven't used EPX, I urge you, learn about this and use this tool. Again, I did this for years without anything like that. And it's so hard to find records even a year or two after deals are done, but the records just go missing, right? Somebody leaves, it's on their laptop, whatever. EPX is an absolute gold mine, and it's a free, cloud-based, fully encrypted tool for use to save all your information. And lastly, these office hours that we offer, it allows you to get myself or one of our other project facilitators, on a phone call, Teams meeting, Zoom meeting, whatever it is with you and your folks to talk about whatever it is you want, right? If you have an issue come up in the performance contract you're running, you're thinking of doing one, you're having problems with one, you want to get some outside outside input to have an impact on your project, we're here to help. So please, fill out this form, and we are here to try to, provide you with whatever value add we can. And that's it. Here is my contact info. Please reach out. You have any other questions, we're more than happy to help. And thank you again for your time. I know this is quite a bit out of somebody's day today. Dub?
Chris, yeah. So two things. I did put a link to sign up for the campaign in the chat, and then
Okay,
also there was
right.
a question there from Sheetal and
Oh,
in
okay.
Key West. You want to take a look at that question about
Yes.
sort of on the procurement side or the procurement phase,
Okay. I see it.
putting together capital stacks and timing.
All right. So thank you, Sheetal, for your question. How do we put different pots of money together from a procurement point of view? Are all funds from grants and budget handed over to a third-party financing firm to handle all the procurement? Right. So the answer, unfortunately, is it depends. Right. So it depends on your organization and how they handle money. Some organizations, like the federal government, can't accept money. Right. That makes it very difficult for them. Right. They can't take money from an ESCO, say. Right. So depending on how your organization is set up, if you're able to take money directly from outside parties, that's usually the best way to do it. In certain cases, depending on how your agreement is with your ESCO, say, you can sign over utility grants, utility rebates and incentives. And I've seen folks do that. So that way they don't want to get involved in securing their rebate and all that. They basically sign that over to the ESCO, and it's their risk then. All right. If you get $1 million, you get $1 million. If you expected to get $1 million and you get $500,000, that's on you, right? It doesn't come out of our financing, right? So it really depends on how you have it set up. And again, like some finance firms that do this, they're not in the business of taking money, right? They're in the business of loaning money. The only time they want to take money is during the repayment of the money they've put into your deal. So like I mentioned about with IRA funding, which is now it's a special case, right? Usually they wouldn't accept money after the fact. They'd give you prepayment penalties, like you see sometimes on home loans and car loans. They want that payment stream to be clean through the term. So you have to set it up with them ahead of time. And that's again something to put into your ESCO RFP and your finance RFP is here are the details of how we expect money to flow back and forth, bilaterally in the process. And again, that's something your financial advisor and your attorneys can help you figure out early on in the process. Did that answer your question, Sheetal?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, great. And again, I'm not a finance person. I'm just an engineer. So from my experience as an owner's rep, that's what I've seen happen. It can certainly be different, but that's what I've seen out there. Any other questions? All right. Well, with that, I think that's a wrap. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the holiday season. If we don't see you, have a happy new year.
And you will get a copy of the slides you've seen today, again, with the live links embedded, so you'll be able to look to those as a resource later and share those with your colleagues.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care.